Guten Tag.
Hello.
Ich denke, wir können beginnen.
I think we can start.
Ich freue mich sehr, Sie
I'm
SWISSAID,
very
the
pleased
Development
to say hello on behalf of SWISSAID and the Center for Development and Environment, CDE, at the University of Bern. Welcome to this webinar. Also, I'd like to thank our supporters, the Foundation, Mercator Swiss, and SWISSAID, our partners. Well, our food is at risk. Agroecology against climate change and pandemics. We do see that it's a topic that moves people, and we have lots of participants, which we are very happy about. I'd like to start with a few technical details. The agency ABL interpreters are supporting us and do a simultaneous translation for us today. So when you go to the bottom of your screen, you have a globe. You can select the language by clicking on that globe and choosing your language in which you'd like to hear and participate. Now, an important plea, do not change that language button during the webinar. The webinar is meant to be interactive. So at the end of the presentation, you find, or at the bottom of the screen, there is that little hand. It means raise your hand and make a comment. So you can raise your hand. When we see you having raised your hand, we can activate your microphone. You then click on OK and can speak. So look for the little hand whenever you want to make a comment. We'd like it to be interactive, as I said, but we will not use the chat. The chat is deactivated. It's merely there for you if you have a technical problem to communicate it. 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions are due to our food. The nitrous oxide is something that is 268 times as dangerous as our CO2. And actually, our food is a problem that triggers the change of climate. And sometimes the years are too dry, sometimes they are too wet, and usually it's in the wrong moment. We do see that there are lots of pests and diseases that come from the milder climates to our climate, and we have more pressure, and we feel we should actually produce more, and we hoard money, and we also do deforestation, and we have even more greenhouse gas emissions. So actually, we realize more and more that through all of that, we have diseases. We have infectious diseases of wildlife habitats that comes to our farm animals and us people. Zoonosis, Ebola, Zika, such zoonosis shall increase. And the UNO development program noticed that in 2016 already. And since the turning of the century, we already saw so many more zoonoses than previously. And the poorest people are the hardest hit. SWISSAID as a development organization and the CDE as a research organization for sustainability wants to help these people. But we should and we must show how systemic these problems really are, and therefore the solution has to be systemic as well. When it comes to resilience of the poorest people, we can not only see whether we are actually in solidarity with each other, but also as a global community, whether we are prepared to respond to these problems that we are faced with a climate change. So I'm really happy that we can have this discussion today, and Mr. Du Boise, Mrs. Gandhi, and Mrs. Jacobi are warmly welcomed because they shall talk about climate change and the food problems to do with it, and the systemic solution named agroecology, which is a sustainable form of food production. I also am happy that it is Andrea Kutschera leading us through the webinar as the moderator. She is an editor of the NZZ on Sonntag, and she is a political scientist. She also studied history of social science, and she can thus well lead us through this complex topic. Ms. Kuchera, you now have the floor. Thank you very much from my side as well, and welcome to this very topical webinar. For your information, it is filmed and recorded so that later we can also come back to this content. We just heard it from Mrs. Sonja Tschirren. When we do agriculture today, it's a driver of climate change, and climate change is the topic of our first speaker. Jacques Du Boise got the attention of a broad public in 2017 because he was then awarded the Nobel Prize for his method of imaging biomolecules. And shortly thereafter, Mr. Du Boise had his coming out as a climate activist, as he calls himself. He is 78 years of age, Professor Emeritus, and goes from climate demonstration to climate demonstration wearing a woolen cap. Jacques Du Boise will explain how the current COVID-19 crisis can also be an opportunity, namely to set a new course in agriculture in favor of the climate and ultimately for us humans. Mr. Du Boise, you have the floor.
Merci. Je vois une impressionnante liste de panélistes.
Thank you. I'm impressed by all the panelists. Some of them I see, and I know there is even a more impressive list of the audience, and a warm welcome from my side. So, I think we're all well aware that the world is going towards a crash. And if we do nothing about it, it will be an unlivable situation for us in the coming future, which is not good. It's not only us who know it, but actually most of our people, the population, they know about it. Whether they believe it is another story, but they know about it. Actually, there are two vehicles to go to the catastrophe, two pathways. The one is climate or global warming. Yeah, the warming of the climate, global warming, is something that's easy to understand, actually, because, okay, temperature goes up, we know that. Temperature goes up, and why? Because we have more CO2 in the atmosphere, and when we have more CO2, that is due to the fossil combustion that we conduct with all this fossil material that has for millions of years been in the earth. So there's a disbalance, and this increase of CO2, which gives an increase in temperature and an increase in fossil combustion. Why is that so? Why do we have more combustion of fossil fuels? Because that is how our economy works. And our economy lives from growth, and if there's no growth, we seem to have a hard time. So the economy always looks for more and more growth. That makes us go towards the catastrophe, and that's not good. So the solution for the climate, we know we should not burn these fossil fuels, and it would be easy to do, wouldn't it? Well, maybe not. Well, the other pathway is there is a ruining of our environment, of our living conditions in our milieu. And here it gets way more complex. Well, yeah, there is something I wanted to say. There's nice weather when I look outside, nice temperature also, and we do know the climate problem is something that we understand by looking at statistics from meteorologists. And statistics, it's true, many of us are not so fascinated by statistics. And then the changing of the cultivation is not so easy to recognize either, because we have these huge cultivation areas and we sometimes don't even realize how it's fabricated, cultivated, what type of chemicals are used. We're not aware, but 2/3, let's say, of the world population, actually they're struggling. They're struggling for their survival just to have food. And for them, the global warming and the ruining of the living environment of the earth is the ruining of their livelihoods, of their living conditions. So this second part, this part of agriculture is well known to my wife because she has these ecological gardens and is very involved there. And when I look at how she works, I wonder how hard people must work in the third world just so that they get some food. And it's true that for most of us, we don't know really what tilling the ground is like, what cultivating is like. So I'm very glad that we gather here to talk about what we are talking about, and to understand more, and that we'd understand what's happening with the worldwide agriculture and the solution that there is, how it is, and how to have this agroecology set up worldwide. So agriculture and ecology combined, that is our future. And we should also decarbonize, of course, our energy. Well, that thus far from me. Thank you.
Herr Du Boise?
Thank you, Mr. Du Boise. We heard agriculture and ecology must be combined, ideally, because it's not always the case. And now I propose that we hear our second speaker, and she will explain more clearly what agroecology is all about and how we could implement it. I'm really happy to have Kavita Gandhi. She is an expert who comes from Odisha in India and has studied forest management and environmental science in India and the United States, and is country representative of SWISSAID for India. For 25 years now, she's been working with small-scale farmers to improve their livelihoods. Odisha is known for its rice diversity, and Ms. Gandhi told me about that when we had our preparatory meeting. There are over 80 local varieties of rice. But because droughts are increasing with climate change, this diversity is threatened. Mrs. Gandhi will show us how the livelihoods of small farmers in Odisha are suffering from climate change, and how agroecology offers new perspective to these small farmers. Ms. Gandhi, you have the floor.
Thank you, Andrea. Good evening, everyone. So, just one second. Okay, my talk today will be about climate change and how it is impacting livelihoods. And it will be based on the work we are doing in Odisha, and also a study which SWISSAID had commissioned to really analyze the meteorological data. So to begin with, so SWISSAID commissioned this study, and the purpose of the study was to see how climate change is impacting agriculture and livelihoods. And we looked at data for over 118 years, and we looked at two data sources. We looked at the temperature data from the Climate Research Unit in East Anglia in UK, and also the rainfall data from the Indian Meteorological Department. Before coming to the findings, I would like to talk a bit about the study site. So we, for this study, we selected a village in Orissa. It is on the screen on the right hand side. You can see the map of India, and this is the state of Orissa. And the village, the study village, Jumat Bahel, is located here. It is predominantly an agriculture society, and it is mainly small farmers with very small land holdings of around 1 hectare or 2.5 acres, as we say in India. And it is rain-fed agriculture, mainly dependent on monsoons. Very few farmers have irrigation. It's a very backward area. Poverty levels are quite high. And this area is also very rich in biodiversity. And in fact, some people claim that this area is very close to the Jaipur tract, which is supposed to be the origin for paddy. Now, coming to the farming system, it is mainly a paddy-based farming system. And on some part of their land, farmers also take mixed crops. Now, so the study came up with some very interesting facts about how temperature has changed. In this slide, I want to show the map of Bargarh district in which this study village is located. And as you can see that this is colored a mango color, and the temperature increase is around 0.87 degree Celsius over 100 plus years. Then we wanted to know whether this temperature increase is happening in the summer months, or is it actually happening in the cropping season. And the main cropping season is the monsoon season, when we get the rains, which is depicted by the blue line here. And and the second season, cropping season, is the winter season, which is depicted by the green line here. And so we found that the temperature increase is happening in the cropping season as well. And this is concerning because there are studies which say that when temperature crosses a certain threshold, then the paddy production actually gets affected. Now, coming to the second slide on rainfall. Before beginning, I would just like to remind that this is a rain-fed agriculture, totally dependent on monsoons. And if the rain doesn't fall on time, then the crop fails, or the yield is reduced substantially. So in this slide, what I want to show you is two things. On the left, you have the annual rainfall pattern in the study village of Jamut Bahal. One can see that the rainfall pattern is actually cyclical in nature. And in fact, it varies quite a bit. It's the variations are huge from one year to the next. Some of you might say, oh, it is cyclical. So, what is new with climate change? But if you look at this line here, the blue line here, which shows the standard deviation, so it basically says that the uncertainty, the erraticity of rainfall is increasing. The second point I want to show in this slide is that the dry days and wet days. So the brown line here represents the dry days, and one finds that the number of dry days has gone up. Dry days are days when there is no rainfall there, which is good for agriculture. So when there is a long time span between two rainfall events, it leads to seasonal drought. So the consecutive dry days have gone up, and therefore crops don't get water at the critical stages of crop growth. So the main findings, it's become warmer. The hot days, very hot days have increased temperature greater than 35 degrees Celsius, leading to a lot of water stress. There is a huge erraticity in rainfall. It can vary from something like a little over 1,000 millimeters to 2,200 millimeters. Imagine a farmer trying to decide which crop to grow. it would be a very difficult decision to make. The monsoons are setting in late. So we used to get monsoons in May, but now it's more like 15 days to a month delayed, which leads to delayed sowing and then crop production getting impacted. The drought vulnerability, the frequency of drought in this area, the crop failure, damage, impact on the quality of the crops, all of that is being seen. So here with this I finished the first part, which was basically the meteorological information. Now I come to what farmers are saying about how climate change is impacting them. And this might be more interesting. So the first thing they say when we talk to women and men farmers, they tell us that, crop loss and failure is becoming more common. Farming is a big gamble for us. We are not sure that we will get a harvest. We are not sure that we'll be able to have enough to sell and get some cash income. And so, for example, some of the changes which they have observed, they say that the growing season has shortened. So earlier when they were taking like 120 days of paddy, now they are taking 110 days and are now searching for seeds which can actually, paddy seeds which can be grown in 100 days and which is a fine paddy rice. The vegetable season has shortened. Earlier, the vegetable season would start in the monsoon, end in around March. Now it is ending in February because in March itself, the temperatures cross 35 degrees Celsius and the vegetables just dry up due to the excess heat. So farming is a...
Frau Gandhi, ich unterbreche nur sehr, sehr ungern. Sie müssen ein bisschen beschleunigen, ganz wenig, damit wir durchkommen.
Ms. Gandhi, you need to speed up a little bit, is what the moderator said. Thank you.
Okay. So what is happening is that the migration, the farmers are coping with it by migrating. And due to migration, one type of migration, the entire family migrates and therefore there's nobody left in the house. And the practice of kitchen gardening, of keeping small livestock is disappearing, or is not disappearing, it's reducing. The debt level of farmers has gone up. And we find that in this scenario, women are suffering the most because their work burden has increased. They are not only responsible for taking care of the elderly and children in the family, but they're also responsible for putting food on the table. And overall, there is a reduction in the diet of people. There's a big nutritional issue here because there's less diversity on the farms. The vegetables and fruits are getting damaged because of excess heat, rain, really stormy, rainy days. So the availability of diverse food is affected. And in this scenario, what is it that SWISSAID is doing? We are promoting agroecology. We are looking at farmer seeds, which are climate resilient. We are enhancing diversity in the vegetable gardens, diversity in the paddy varieties, diversity in terms of income sources. We are looking at building people's collectives. We are looking at women's empowerment. Thank you.
Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gandhi. We heard it. Resilience is the command of the hour. There are certain types that are more resilient than others, and agriculture needs to be made fit for climate change. And agroecology is not monoculture, but it is diverse agriculture. Agroecology can also mean that we combine managing forests and doing agriculture and crop growing. And I'm very happy to have Johanna Jacobi, yet another specialist in this field, because she can now tell us what science will tell us about agroecology. She just became the assistant professor for the Agroecological Transitions at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, ETH Zurich. As a child, Ms. Jacobi already wondered why the rainforest is disappearing, and later she made environmental degradation and agriculture and the link to a research focus. She studied geography and biology for the University of Bern in Bolivia until the outbreak of COVID-19, and that on agroforestry and cocoa production. So she will tell us about that term agroforestry and what it's about. And secondly, she will show us that agroecology is a highly political issue, not only a scientific issue, but it has a lot to do with our societies and with politics. Ms. Jacobi, I look forward to your input.
Can you hear me?
Ohne Probleme.
Okay, and can someone confirm that you can see my screen also? Perfect. Okay, so thank you so much for inviting me today. My contribution today is about agroecology linked to climate change and food and what that means for food system transformation. So first, agroecology is often called the science of sustainable agriculture. And of course, there are many different understandings, but usually they have some things in common. First, agroecology links agronomy with ecology, which means realigning agriculture with ecological principles. And then second, it's not only a science, it's also a set of practices, a know-how, and it's also a social movement that engages for political change. And then third, agroecology is really an integrative concept that has components from the natural sciences on production and ecosystems and also from the social sciences by integrating all the new knowledge. And this means that agroecology as a science is really inter and transdisciplinary. But it's also interesting to look at what's often said that agroecology is not. So it's not fixed recipes or technological packages, because agroecology uses ecosystem principles instead. It's also not just the substitution of inputs, say a pesticide with a biopesticide, and it's also not just the compliance with certification. Then it's also not just the application of one isolated practice, because if an industrial vegetable farm, like on these pictures here, has flowers for insects next to their fields where they spray highly hazardous pesticides, then that's not agroecology because it doesn't take into account the other principles. And then also such a system may not store carbon from the atmosphere like a diversified farming system or landscape does, neither in the soil nor in the plants. And they use lots of inputs that are based on fossil fuels. So a more convincing alternative is agroforestry. So that means agriculture with trees, and this can include livestock as well as crops. And it refers to many agriculture practices like home gardens or alley cropping or living fences or windbreaks, shade trees, and many other practices. And an agroforestry system involves at least two species. That can be a woody perennial and another plant, or an animal species. And that means that even the most simple agroforestry system is more complex in ecological and economic terms than a monocropping system. So here's one example from Bolivia showing cocoa trees, which is the main cash crop here, which is combined with banana and other fruit trees for family food security and for the short-term income. But then there are also timber trees, such as mahogany, which work like a bank account for the families, and they grow slowly as a long-term investment. So in my research, I compared 3 different ways of producing cocoa regarding their resilience to climate change and other impacts. And here you can see a cocoa monoculture, and that's increasingly common and promoted for high short-term yields. On this picture, the second system that I compared with this is cocoa agroforestry with shade trees, which is more traditional and more biodiverse. And the third one is dynamic agroforestry, which is also known as successional agroforestry. And that follows the ecological principles of a forest with a high biodiversity and a high plant density, so that all spaces are filled and used with annual crops on the ground and cocoa and timber trees vertically. And on the stems, sometimes you can have pepper or vanilla growing. So that obviously requires a lot of knowledge and also pruning, because the biomass accumulates on the soil so that the soil is always covered and always moist. So this graph shows some of the results. So the corners of the spider web are the indicators of resilience. So we have soil organic matter, we have the AH horizon of the soil, we have soil compaction, we have diversity of trees and crops, we have the diversity of ants, of cocoa yield, and also the presence of a disease that's called witch's broom disease. And the three different lines are the three different cultivation systems. So red is the monoculture, we have blue is the simple agroforestry system, and the orange one is the dynamic agroforestry system. So we can see that the AH horizon, which is the part of the soil that has visible organic matter in it, is much higher in agroforestry. And then also cocoa yield was higher. But I found that this was more linked to the knowledge that the farmers had than what system they used, because they needed to know how to prune a cocoa tree and things like that. So these are just some of the fruits that you can find in a cocoa agroforestry system in Bolivia. And some benefits of a diversified agroforestry system can be like improving physical and chemical soil properties, but then also you can have less water stress. And as you can see, a wide range of products like fruits, but also vegetables, fodder, firewood, construction materials, or traditional medicines. And there are also ornamental plants. So that means that agroforestry systems are really a space of biodiversity. And on the socioeconomic side, it really makes a big difference for people to work in the shade. And diversification of food and income increases also social ecological resilience and household food security overall. There's a new meta-analysis on which I participated that showed that cocoa yield, over 52 studies on cocoa comparing monoculture and agroforestry, and yield was overall like 25% lower under agroforestry. But if we calculate the total system yield, like all the bananas and everything that people harvest, then yield is more than 10 times higher in the agroforestry systems than in the monoculture. And then they also store like 2 to 3 times more carbon from the atmosphere, which is a side effect of global relevance, of course. So that means that agroforestry systems really have the potential to compete with or even outperform monocultures. Constraints are, of course, also there. So there's the availability of plants and seeds is often a constraint. Then also the equipment that's needed or the ability for shade management. Then also the knowledge, the labor. Markets are often only established for one cash crop like cocoa, and the rest you really cannot sell. Then cocoa varieties, for instance, have been developed to grow in full sun systems in monocultures, even though the cocoa tree is actually from under the understory of the rainforest. So it naturally grows under shade. But there's also another side to agroecology. It's really a socio-political struggle. So social justice and ecological sustainability are really inseparably linked in food and agriculture. And agroecology is also a struggle for land and autonomy. It's against ecocide and the concentration of power in the food system. So when we want to talk about agroforestry, we need to ask who does it? People need to be able to do it, to make a living from it. Then land is needed and value chains for the diverse products need to be developed. That can also lead then to healthier diets. So that really means a far-reaching transformation of our social ecological systems towards more fairness and sustainability. And agroecology really brings those points together, like biodiversity and healthy food and meaningful work. And in doing so, it becomes really highly political. It's about labor conditions, about the distribution of land, about participating in the decisions of the food we eat and the landscapes we live in. So I want to show one framework for transitions in agroecology. That's the 5-level approach by Gliesman. So we can see here level 0 is no agroecological integration, but then at level 1, the production is made more efficient by reducing the overall inputs, like the fertilizers, the fuels, the pesticides. And that can be across all types of farming systems, like from conventional to organic. And then at level 2, the external synthetic inputs are then replaced with more sustainable inputs, like biofertilizers or organic pest management, but still without reorganizing the whole farming system. So sometimes top-down interventions have this as a final goal, but this alone is not transformative, it's only incremental. But then at level 3, this is a real change because it involves the real redesign of the production system based on agroecological principles. For example, intercropping and compost or mixed farming, but this still takes place at the farm level. And then at level 4, the connections between the producers and the consumers are rebuilt and strengthened. So this is to have markets for agroecological products, for instance, and for solidarity between farms and other actors in the value chain. And then level 5 is an even deeper and wider transformation of the food system. It involves policies and rules and institutions and culture, and it focuses on social justice and on democracy to build really a new global food system that's not only sustainable, but helps to restore and also to protect life on Earth. So this is then the transformational and food system level. And one really important starting point is the knowledge that hunger is not in the first place a problem of the quantity of food produced, because the world could already feed 10 billion people now. It's a problem of distribution. It's a problem of poverty and inequality. Or as here, Francis Moulapé, the founder of Food First, puts it, it's a lack of democracy, because food goes where the buying power is and not where the need is. And the key problem in today's food systems is really the concentration of power, together then with a lack of transparency and a lack of participation of those who are involved, like the farmers and the food workers. And then there's also a lack of access to productive resources like land and seeds. So if we look at this as a concept, this graph shows how dominant food systems are currently organized. So there are many producers here on top and many consumers here on the bottom, but the other involved actors like the processors, the traders, the retailers, input providers, or even the politicians who decide are like very few actors in between, which accumulate a lot of decision-making power. And they shape not only what's being produced and how, but also, and with what technology, but also what's being eaten. And so one way to overcome the situation is to build the alternatives by more directly linking producers and consumers, like for example, through farmers markets or community-supported agriculture. In Switzerland, that's often called contract farming, and many other examples. And this means that power is less concentrated with few actors, and therefore it's a democratization of food systems. And only then can we really think about how the potential of agroforestry for food security and biodiversity and climate change and health can really be fulfilled. So thank you very much.
Vielen Dank allen drei Redner und Rednerinnen.
Thank you very much to the three presenters. That was very interesting indeed. Well, a solution in agriculture that does not keep driving climate change by emitting a lot of CO2 would be an agroecological approach. We heard it from Ms. Gandhi in India. They do it with the help of SWISSAID. In Bolivia, there are also such approaches, as we just heard by Ms. Jacobi. And Ms. Jacobi thrust us into the political discussion. She showed us merely advantages of this agriculture, and we'll see during our discussion whether everybody is of the opinion that there are only advantages to it, because it's actually a problem of power distribution, of land distribution. The ones that now benefit of the current system are against the transformation, and we shall come back to that. It's also a problem of the markets, of accessibility, and of the knowledge of consumers. How do we know whether the food we buy is produced agroecologically or not? So these are points that we can take up in the discussion. Before we move on to the discussion, I'd like to know whether you have questions of clarification for the three speakers. If you have questions of clarification, you can ask them now. Mrs. Children explained how it works. You should raise your hand.
Man wird sie freischalten.
I will then call on you, activate your microphone. You then just click on OK to be heard by the floor afterwards. There is no silly question. Feel free to ask your question. I do see first hands raised.
Genau. Wer möchte gerne eine Frage stellen?
Would like to ask a question?
Dann wir Tatjana Steiger.
Tatjana Steiger. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, we can. Ms. Jacobi, question to you. Did I understand you correctly? Did you say that agroecology is also a concept that would look or lead to a more just distribution of land? So does agroecology help that there be a more just land distribution? Does it help in this difficult question?
Yes, I would. Thanks for the question. I mean, this, of course, is really complex, but I would rather say it the other way around. For agroecology to happen, we need to look at land distribution. I mean, now we have like 1.5 billion small farmers in the world that are on 20 to 30% of the land and produce like 50 to 70% of the food. And we're still having so many people who are food insecure and the number is rising. So we can think about what would happen if they had 60 or 70% of the land, no? So I would rather put it that way around, and I think it needs to be definitely be part of the discussion.
Ich sehe eine weitere Hand, die von
I
Ulysse.
see another hand raised, Ulysse Le Golf. Yes, hello. Thank you to all the participants for the presentations. I work with the ETHZ Zurich to do with agroecology and agroforestry. And all that has been said about agroforestry for countries in the south is, of course, also true in Europe, even if we have very different conditions here. It actually allows that we can increase resilience in agroforestry, and we have very similar obstacles. Namely, it is atypical firms or farms, that go into agroforestry, and generally speaking, it's usually farms that do direct selling of their products, because there are the market problems, distribution problems, competition problems between producers where sometimes they have no other market access. So we should support such steps towards agroforestry also in Europe that will help to find solutions, even when there is a lot of competition, and also directly connect with the consumers, because I think many consumers are interested in that direct selling process, even though if it's complicated, then there is also the problem of further training for the farmers, because they would need to work differently than what they had learned thus far. And all that takes time to set up and make evolve. And I'll be very happy to participate in the discussion thereafter.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you.
Genau, wenn ich das richtig gehört habe, war das jetzt noch keine.
If I understood that correctly, you were rather putting in a point for discussion. It wasn't really a question of clarification. Right now it's for clarification questions. Please, if you have clarification questions, this is your time to ask them. Laurent von Villers has a question. Go ahead. Yeah, thank you. Actually, I don't have a question either. I have a comment to the comment that has just been made, and it's very interesting, I find. That is not only agroecology for India and Bolivia, even though it's very important there, but also Switzerland is a topic that needs to be tackled. But of course, I can make my comment later on if it's now just for clarifications. Okay, fine. Now, if there are no further questions to clarify things, let's move on and to have a little moment of relaxation. We'll have a quiz. And then we'll have various theses to discuss or statements to discuss. Now a little quiz. Let's see how much of the said has stuck with you. It's a multiple choice survey that shall pop up on your screen. Sometimes you can give or tick several boxes. Several answers may apply, and at the end, we'll look at your answers. So tick all the boxes that apply. I will also fill it out, and then we will start into the discussion.
So, ich denke, wir sind nun alle ready für die Diskussion.
I think we're all ready for the discussion now. Later, we'll come back to the quiz at the very end. Now, as announced, the discussion is meant to be very open. With Iris Ligoff, we already had a really entry point into the discussion where he said we should have more direct selling and changed competition conditions. Now, we have 3 to 4 statements, and you know how it works with raising your hand. You have them in 3 languages. So first, do you agree or disagree with what Ms. Jacobi said? Well, agroecological systems are more resilient. They only have advantages, it seems, more resilient to climate change. And would that be true that by 2050, conventional agriculture will be a thing of the past? Now, I wonder who shares that opinion and who thinks, no, that's presumptuous to say that, or that's not a nice future perspective at all. You could now make your comments on that statement. Agroecological systems are more resilient to climate change. By 2050, conventional agriculture will be a thing of the past. Manuel Flurivalen, you have the floor. Thank you very much. And thank you also for the interesting inputs. Well, the question is not whether we like that or not, find it good or not, but it's a must. We need to be there by 2050. And I'd like to add another aspect. I fully agree with Johanna Jacobi. Land is the central question. With Kavita Gandhi, I saw that also the seeds question was raised because she mentioned that in Odisha, where she's working, there are 80 local types of rice. And we also know that internationally speaking, there is a huge concentration of seeds production and the differentiated types of seeds that are well adapted to the climatic situations and that are a huge potential for the future. Actually, these types of seeds are pushed more and more to the margin by international regulation. So we must realize how Oh, significant. The local seed is. She also talked, Ms. Gandhi, about the seed banks. And I think the two main lines of action, land for the farmers and the local seeds, must be something that's supported also on international level, so that this goal that by 2050 conventional agriculture be a thing of the past could be reached. It's not whether we wish it to be so, it's a must. Thank you for the interesting discussion round. May I throw the question back? You said this or that would need to happen, but do you really believe personally that by 2050 we will only have agroecology on the planet Earth? Well, I believe in it, but I'm 66 years of age, so maybe it's easy for me to believe in that. No, you know, I do believe it. No, because I see activity of people and international associations and national initiatives that go towards this direction. I believe we still have the opportunity to reach that point, so I believe it. Thank you. We shall come to these initiatives later on. I see Angelika Hilbeck who'd like to speak. Yes, I'd like to pick up the thread of my previous speaker. My viewpoint is different. I do not believe that we have that much time to go up until 2050, because this would still be 30 years in which we'd use a lot of pesticide, and our insects and bees will not make it that long. So it must be much earlier that we really need to adapt strongly these synthetic means, and that lead biodiversity to collapse needs to be stopped. And we cannot wait with that for 30 years. That'd be a catastrophe for our pollinators, for our insects. So I think we need to do something much, much earlier on, especially the countries in the north, because that is where we have the collapse of the biodiverse systems. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, the problem with the biodiversity loss is something that we see also in Switzerland. Yes, it's more than only climate change, for sure. I now see that Mila would like to take the floor. Mila? Thank you for the inputs. So I want to stick with that discussion, and I do believe that conventional agriculture, that it be a thing of the past, much depends on the definition we attach to conventional agriculture. And what I believe is very important in order to reach that goal, and the previous speaker said things that I agree with, it is urgent. I agree with the urgency, and therefore I think in education we need to set the signs and the right pathway. I know the educational system in Switzerland, and education is not really geared on a big change in the near future. So education and research needs to be combined to make a change. Very interesting. Any comment about education? What would that mean? Would we then, together with all the children, do gardening instead of maths in order to show them the interconnections? Or what would you suggest concretely to the topic of education and research? I see many, many hands go up.
Ich sehe Ulysse Le Goff.
Ulysse Le Goff. Thank you. Education of the farmers on one hand, but also general food education. There's that Slow Food Swiss initiative, and it should be in our constitution. It should be integrated. This type of initiative is interesting. It's very complex questions, and it's hard to have an opinion for people who are totally new to the field. So I think, yes, we need to work on education also where farmers are concerned and improve their education as well. Thank you. Thank you for this input. Ms. Jacobi would like to say something.
Yes, I would like to summarize the comments a bit. I feel they go into a direction like the education, or I want to say something about the food movements that are happening also in Switzerland. Obviously, we need to think broader. I mean, we know insects are disappearing. Switzerland has also huge problems with pollution, habitat fragmentation, eutrophisation, and so on. But why have all these subsidies and regulations that are there not managed to stop these trends? And for this, I really think in education and elsewhere in society, the realms of health, human health, ecosystem health, agriculture, biodiversity conservation have to come together. And like Switzerland has a sustainability council, it could also develop a food policy council. And I see that in many Swiss cities, food parliaments are forming. And they are really a platform for what I call the democratization of food systems, where citizens can participate and together co-create the solutions and require, for example, taxpayers, they pay for the subsidies. I mean, they could require that they only be used for agroecology, for instance, or also internationally. I mean, Switzerland is a climate superpower. If we think internationally, it could really like require all investments, even by the private sector, to be useful for climate and biodiversity. Just think of the chocolate industry, for instance. If they'd only buy cocoa only from agroforestry systems, that would be a huge impact, and then pay better for agroforestry cocoa or something. I think there's so much that can be done when we start to think, to stop thinking in silos and start thinking like human health and ecosystem health together. Thank you.
Ja, vielen Dank für diesen Input.
Thank you for this input. We heard a lot. We heard that we need improvement in education for farmers and consumers, and that these direct payments be only made when agroecology is applied by farmers. We have an initiative that requires that is coming up in Switzerland. But now we also have this other agro initiative that we want to discuss. The second statement is what we move to now. We heard that the incentives are not yet sufficient, that in the near future we'll only have agroecology in agriculture. So there is the initiative for banning pesticides in Switzerland, and probably in summer, in June, we'll vote on it. It's a ban that we vote on for pesticides in agriculture. And the thesis is, or this statement, the Swiss referendum on banning pesticides in agriculture, is it an effective way to reorient incentives and support agroecology? What are your opinions on this?
Sich gemeldet hat.
Ms. Julia Chersig.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for the presentations, which were really insightful. I'm Julia. I'm working in a project on called Right Seeds. So we're looking at common approaches in seeds. And I would, regarding that question, I would like to argue that it's an important first step, but we have to think a lot broader than this. Because at the moment we have regulations in place that make it really hard for diverse varieties, which are of course an important aspect of agroecological systems, to be able to be put on the market in the first place. So we have seed legislation that only allows to put very homogeneous varieties on the market. And also we have institutions that support intellectual property rights on seeds, and that also make it really hard to share seeds and support, for instance, community seed banks and approaches like this. So I think if you want to have like a deep transformation in agriculture, then we need to look also at institutions and how we can change them. Thank you.
Vielen Dank. Genau, ich denke,
Thank you very much.
was mich wirklich noch interessieren würde, denken
What I'm really interested in now, you, Mrs. Chirich and Cherish and the other participants, do you believe that with that referendum that we'll have in Switzerland, a referendum on banning pesticides, do you think if that referendum is accepted, that is a way to reorient incentives and support agroecology? I'd like to hear more people speak up on that. Miss Julia Chersit introduced herself well by giving her name and her function. So that's nice if the other participants could also do that, so we'd always know what your background is. That makes it more interesting. Sorry, Laurent von Willer, you have the floor.
Herr von Willer, oder habe ich das falsch verstanden?
Mr. von Willer, or your hand still up? Maybe it's a mistake. Can you hear me? Yes, we can.
Mein Name ist Laurent von Willer, ich bin Mitglied der
Von Willer, member of the organization called Unitaire, and I study agroecology in that context. Now, I'd like to say that agroecology, if we want to promote it in Switzerland or worldwide, is much more than the question of pesticides. It goes much further than that. Personally, I think that these two initiatives that we have in Switzerland can be useful. It's interesting in the context of things that were said, like the drinking water initiative that foresees that the federal state would have measures taken through the direct payments. And then we also have the training, consulting. And I think these are important elements, because if we want a radical change, we cannot wait until 2070. So we need to support the farmers. I think we have 10% of organic farmers in Switzerland, so 90% conventional farmers, and they will not just by themselves switch over to an agroecological system. It needs research in the area of pesticides. Chemical pesticides need to be replaced by biopesticides, or very different pesticides that need support in research and support practically of the farmers, and consumers need to understand this. So I think it's a very large field of measures that need to be taken, but maybe this initiative on pesticides could be a starting point. And if we look at the free trade agreement on palm oil that had 48% of no's when we had the referendum just now, we can be optimistic, I believe, even though, of course, there will be a lot of opposition also against a change towards agroecology. It's interesting, you talk of opposition, and Ms. Jacobi also talked of opposition a while ago.
Stimmen, die sich melden.
I see different people that like to talk. Christina Blunt.
Können Sie mich hören?
Ja.
Can you hear me? Yes, we can. I'm Christina Blanc. I work for the agency, Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, SDC. I have another element that I'd like to bring into the discussion, and also an appeal to the researchers to keep up the research. This transition towards more agroecology is also hindered because there is no true cost accounting. So a lot of the negative externalities of the current agricultural system, both in Switzerland and globally, are actually paid for indirectly by the general public and are not really applied to the food cost. So the agroecological foodstuffs are then more expensive, even though actually these other external negative effects that are not there would have a better balance. So this true cost accounting story is important because it will give us arguments, like Mrs. Jacobi mentioned, that power imbalance, these actors who do not want to lose their power, and these negative externalities, if they were better taken into account, that would certainly also contribute to that transition towards agroecology. Thank you.
Ja, vielen Dank. Wer würde sich gerne dazu noch
Thank
äußern?
you. Anybody would like to talk about these externalities or that question of the pesticide referendum? Pamela Statakis has raised her hand.
Ja, hallo.
Yes, hello. I have another question, not to this topic. That's okay, go ahead. So as a counter argument, it's often said that agroecology cannot nourish all of the world's population. But you, Ms. Jacobi, said it's not the problem that there is not enough food, but actually this argument is always put forward as if it were a problem of quantity, and that agroecology could not meet the need to feed the people because it is more work intensive, it is said, and because the surfaces are much smaller. So I'd like to know from your side what you answer to that objection.
Ja, gerne, Frau Jacobi.
Ms. Jacobi?
Thanks for that question. So I really think, and the evidence is very clear, that this is a false narrative that is still used to manifest the power imbalances that are in place nowadays. No, if we look at efficiency, we really need to use other metrics than just the yield of one crop per hectare. We need efficiency, like measuring in energy efficiency, how much energy is used, how many calories are used to produce 1 food calories. In industrial agriculture, that's often like 10 calories are used to produce 1 calorie. We found even in the research in Kenya, for 39 calories produced, for 1 calorie produced, industrial agriculture uses 39 calories. That's highly inefficient. And in agroecology, there's also data on that. You can read the studies. I mean, they are energy positive. So this is really, if you look at the scientific evidence, these arguments don't hold true. And the neo-Malthusianism that's put forward to say that agroecology cannot feed the world, it's very easy to debunk this myth, because industrial agriculture can also not feed the world. I mean, the hungry people, the number of hungry people is constantly increasing, and this is not something that is working. The food system is broken, and I think there are really alternatives that could do it much better, and the evidence is behind that. I mean, I don't want to go into more detail now, but look at the data and the science. I think it's quite clear.
Thank you.
Vielen Dank. Ich schlage vor, wir gehen zum...
Thank you. I propose we move over to the last statement, third and last statement. As you've heard from many of the speakers, it's also a question of the market and possibly what we could buy. So agroecological food, if it were labeled and if it were healthy food and organically produced food, which currently often is more expensive. So there is the mere problem that consumers that would want to support agroecology and would want to buy such products cannot do so directly because they lack the information of what is produced agroecologically or not. So what do you say about that question, that it is not possible from a consumer viewpoint to support that directly? What is your opinion? Urs Brandli.
Ja, hören Sie mich?
Can you hear me? Yes. I'm Urs Brandli, president of BioSwiss, and for 30 years I had an organic farm that I was responsible for or managing. So the question is one of the consumers, their trust and what they gain in all of it. Now, organic is well established in Switzerland, market share of 10%. And for 40 years now, BioSwiss informs on what organic food is. And if you ask people on the streets, what does that consist, organic, then you hear of 50% of more that they actually still don't know what organic or bio really stands for. And many believe it's just a marketing gimmick. So it's a huge challenge. And well, of course, I'm in favor of this initiative on agroecology. On the other hand, it's a huge challenge, namely, how could we show the people what it's all about? How could we create a trust that they would buy the correctly labeled products? Because at the end of the day, besides the true cost side that was mentioned, namely that cheap food is at the end of the day not really cheap for all of society, but much more expensive. That all is the key to success of change, is the change in the consumer's behavior. So if consumers, whenever they go shopping, whenever they take a product from the shelf, which at the same time is also an order, because then the order goes back to replenish the shelf. So we have to do our utmost to show the people and to give them trust, to let them know what are the products they ought to buy and what they create by buying it, what kind of CO2 balance they create or carbonic footprint by taking this or the other product from the shelf.
Vielen Dank. Ich würd gleich Mila das
Wort
erteilen. Mich interessiert jetzt aber trotzdem
noch. Will speak after that, but Mr. Brandli, since I speak to the president of BioSwiss here, I'd like to know from you. Would you say that who buys organic products buys agroecologically produced products? Is it as simple as that? Yes, I did, of course, look at agroecology for some time now already. Meanwhile, it's 1.5 years ago where SWISSAID had the first workshop on the topic. I was part of it. It was very interesting. And when we look at it, we actually see that agroecology contains a lot of organic, but it goes further than organic. If we look at the bud label, which goes also further than the organic label, conventionally speaking, we are on a similar pathway, the label organic or bio and the label bud in Switzerland. So I also know that in many regions of this world, organic food has a bad name, or a name that people struggle with. And we had the same situation 20 years ago in Switzerland. Meanwhile, organic and also our label bio is well established as regards products and production in Switzerland. In other countries, they struggle with that. But once agroecology is better explained, understood, and the farmers go towards a more sustainable production way, then I believe we will be on a good pathway to also incite consumers to a more sustainable behavior. True cost was mentioned. And of course, true cost is not only true when it comes to foodstuffs, but with all our consumers' behavior. We heard about India, and if I just think of our clothes, how we produce cotton, then we have huge differences, or our mobility and so forth. So the true cost to depict it in the products, that will be the key towards a sustainable consumer's behavior. Thank you. So that was a publicity spot also for your bio label. And Mila now has the floor.
Hören Sie mich jetzt?
Ja. Can you hear me? Yes.
Dann hole ich das noch kurz nach mit meiner Vorstellung.
Okay. I'm Mila Lager, studied geography at the University of Bern. And when I did my master's degree, I looked at the permaculture in Switzerland, and I'm still working in that niche. And now I do an internship at the Inforama in Bern, very much into permaculture. And as far as I've understood, this is a very similar concept to agroecology as we discuss it here. And as regards the consumers, my experience in all the different farms that I was in is that the ones that undertake a more diversified path have a very direct contact with their customers. That's what Johanna Jacobi showed us, namely that the direct way from the producer to the consumer takes place. And then the real prices can also better be reached. And what I also often observe today is with interns that just work for mere food and board, and then that will also reduce the costs for the producers. And I think in Coop and Migros, our supermarkets, the bio label organic food is a good alternative, and I think these farmers would be ready to go towards agroecology, the ones who embraced the bio organic label. And then the label bio and the label bud are very clearly regulated, whereas here it's a bigger scope for maneuver in agroecology to develop it further. And maybe a point to the last statement here, with that prohibition or ban, if the people accepted that ban of pesticides, like Laurent Fauvillers said, we need to accompany the farmers on that way. I offer courses on permaculture in agriculture, and I have farmers who for 20-25 years manage their farms and are well conscious that change is needed and look out for solutions. And currently there's not much around to really help them to see the way of change that is viable for them in their current situation based on their education and to bring about change. Thank you very much. We slowly come to the end of the discussion. I would love at this point to hear Mrs. Gandhi with her input from India. And then I see that Mr. Du Boise would also like to make a statement. And
Frau Jacobi, ich weiß auch, dass
Ms.
Sie
Jacobi, I know that she believes when we talk labels that it shouldn't be a label for bio or organic, but whatever is not organic, bio or organic should be the normal, the standard, and we should label whatever is dangerous, contains pesticides. We should put a warning on all such products, is what Ms. Jacobi pleads for. That's interesting. Maybe she'll say something about that. Now,
Frau Gandhi, wie Sie das sehen.
Ms. Gandhi,
Yeah.
what is your viewpoint on this direct marketing? How could we help the farmers in Odisha with that direct marketing? Afterwards, Jacques Du Boise, and afterwards, maybe Ms. Jacobi, and if not, I'll hand back to Ms. Chiren. Ms. Gandhi, you have the floor.
Yeah, I would like to start by saying that, I go back to the words of Mr. Du Boise when he said that when we think about small farmers in the South, we're thinking of people who are struggling to put food on the table. And so as one thing which we struggle with in SWISSAID is like, at one hand, we are taking the farmers' knowledge and we are upscaling it and taking it to larger number of farmers, but a transition beyond a certain point requires a whole ecosystem to come up to facilitate this. for the farmers, I have to have a convincing case as to why they should, beyond their own consumption, why they should convert their farms to agroecology. They need markets, they need better prices, they need, they need support in the transition process, they need some safety nets to fall back upon. So that is one. The second is we need the research system to work for farmer seeds, for traditional produce. We need more research on shorter duration varieties of paddy, of millets, of challenges which come in processing, which can reduce women's workload. We need support for characterization of seeds, of quality seed production, so that we can scale up. We need, on the marketing side, we need support in terms of the consumers are there in the metro areas, but we need more awareness at maybe in other medium town cities, in smaller towns and blocks. We need more awareness about food, about nutrition, about the nutritional benefits of consuming certain types of rice or certain millets. That knowledge is slowly getting lost. So we need to support the farmers with some kind of the tie-ups of the direct marketing types which are being talked about. In cities, we do see more like from the peri-urban areas, you have farmers, and then you have consumers in the cities, and you have a very close trust which is built. You have visits to farmer fields. Now how would that work for a small town? What is the paying capacity of consumers there? We really need to understand that. But there needs, on the market side, there needs to be definitely some kind of a premium for farmers who are putting so much of hard work. And sometimes I feel that people can buy a jeans for 3,000 rupees, but they hesitate to put or a mobile phone, they spend so much of money, but we really don't understand how difficult farming is. And everybody, I think, whether it's urban, from the schools itself, we need to understand farming, and we need to have a closer link and a relationship with nature. And definitely then nobody is going to question about the costs, once you actually get into farming, I believe. So I think a whole ecosystem really has to come up to support this transition, and it is actually a systemic change that we are talking about. And definitely, if we wait till 2050, many of these small farmers will not be there. They will be in the cities, or they would have migrated to other countries. So, and the situation would be really bad. God knows what we would be eating. So definitely it's very urgent, and the action is required now. We can't really wait till 2050. So that's it. Thank you.
Vielen Dank. Sehr vieles, was wir jetzt gehört haben, nehmen wir unter anderem auch
Thank you. A lot of what we heard now is that we cannot wait, and that the farmers need the support, need to be convinced to really target on that agroecology. Jacques Du Boise, concisely, please. Thank you. I too have a right to ask a question, I think, even as a panelist, even though I may be an incompetent one if I look at the people who spoke. But there's one point. When we look at climate, there is a very strong narrative that we need to go very quickly out of fossil carbon because the glaciers are melting and we have the CO2 law and so forth, and we'll go at an even faster pace. So that's what I said in the beginning. The argument actually is simple. Go out of carbon, stop with it, and then we will manage. As regards agroecology, what is the message that we have to give? The shock message that will create that shock that millions of Swiss, not only 10%, but 90% would produce organically. How could we create that shock? That's my question.
Das war, nehme ich an, eine Frage. Ich würde sagen.
That was a question, and this question goes to Ms. Jacobi at the end. And then Ms. Chirin will have the final word. So how do we go about not being stuck at 10%, but move the rate up to 90% that produce organically, is what Mr. Du Boise said or asked.
Thanks. I would really advocate to think in terms of this whole transition towards a really transformed global food system. And I would advocate to see also the labels, the organic labels and all other labels only as part, as a step of this transition and not get stuck there. It's important, but we can't stay there because there are millions of farmers in the world who already produce organically. They cannot afford to pay for certification. Even in Switzerland, there are farmers who produce it away, but they cannot afford it. So I think it's really unjust to make the people who actually do something good to pay to show it in the markets. So that's why I sometimes advocate for the polluter pays principle. We could say, careful, this contains deforestation, or careful, this product contains slave labor. So that's why I sometimes say this is important to turn this around, or to think more broadly about this transformation, not get stuck at a specific stage there. And also to shift the responsibility to the consumer, I think is unfair, because this is not, I mean, it's important, but it's not enough. And it's the consumers, I mean, we pay at the checkout at the supermarket, we pay the subsidies, we pay the restoration of the ecosystems that are destroyed, and we pay the health costs that the unhealthy food system causes. So this is really unfair. And we even here, we have to think broader. We have to use landscape approaches. We have to, I mean, also the public sector is a huge customer. For example, we can think of public procurement. Why is the food in canteens of universities, schools, hospitals, prisons, why is that not all local, fair, ecologically produced? So I really advocate for thinking much more broadly in these terms.
Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much. I'm very impressed by the quality of the discussion. And I also understood that the first statement where we said up until 2050 we'll only have agroecology agriculture, everybody seems to, how should I put it? They say it's even a conservative goal. And here the opinion seems to be rampant that it needs to go even faster. It's like the initiators of the Glacier Initiative. They said until 2050 we have to be CO2 neutral, and they thought this is ambitious, but now meanwhile even our Federal Council wants that. So I hand back to Sonja Chirin and say thank you for this good and lively discussion. Yes, Andrea Kuchera, and thank you. That was really a very interesting discussion. Thank you also, Ms. Kuchera, for the good moderation of that webinar. We talked of a number of points in a brief way, but we had very interesting solution approaches, how we could reshape our food systems to stop climate change and still have everybody of us food on the table, both in the north in Switzerland, but also in the global south. Now I'd like to say thank you, and I'll show you now the result of the quiz. What we see clearly is that we have very different opinions on the direction to take. You see that with a question.
Sie leisten kann, das wurde sehr eindeutig
What
beantwortet.
agroecology is and what it could reach. Then you see question 1, the greenhouse gas emissions. There is a spread of opinions, as there is a spread of opinions in research, but actually we say it is about a third, but some would reckon it's higher than that. The second question, I think it's also quite clear. On the one hand, what climate change causes in that area and what it would mean on the other hand, like what is urgently to be undertaken so that we won't have that many zoonoses in the future as we currently do.
Ich danke Ihnen deswegen jetzt, dass Sie da so aktiv mitgemacht haben.
Thank you very much for your active participation. To all the participants, And here I would also say thank you to you, Mr. Du Boise, to you, Kavita Gandhi, and to you, Ms. Jana Jacobi, for having enabled this discussion with that richness of inputs and possible solutions that you've presented. At the end, let me say that after the webinar is prior to the webinar, because we launch a webinar series, we'll have a next webinar on the topic of biodiversity and food, end of April, beginning of May, and we'd be very happy if you participated in that. So when you go out of the webinar, there will be a pop-up of a very short survey of what you think about this webinar. It will help us when you fill out these questions. It will come when you get out of the webinar. That pop-up will come then, and we're glad if you answer these simple, quick questions. So thank you for your participation. Even though we are a bit longer than planned, thank you for bearing with us. I think we could discuss days and nights on end. So 10 minutes overtime is actually quite moderate. Thank you for your inputs. Thank you for all participants, and stay healthy until we meet again. Thank you also on behalf of us, the SWISSAID team, and all the best to you. And thank you also from your interpreter.